Hello and good evening. Shalom lachem to all our viewers, international and here in Israel. We are very happy to be here with you in the first International Agnon Festival. שלום גם לצופים שלנו בארץ. המפגש הזה יתקיים בשפה האנגלית. מי שמעוניין לשמוע תרגום לעברית יכול ללחוץ על Interpretation, על הכפתור עם הגלובוס, וילחוץ על השפה העברית. We are very happy to host in this festival, this event, the talk between Dorit Rabinyan and Nicole Krauss. The title of this event is Exile and Homeland, a very Agnonian topic, I have to say, because Agnon wrote from here, from Jerusalem, about Buchach, about his homeland, and we are very excited and waiting to hear what you have to say. And I want to introduce you the moderator of this event, the writer and editor and translator, Benjamin Balint. Good evening.
Thank you so much, Asaf. A warm welcome to all of you lovers of literature at home. It's a real pleasure to welcome two of my absolute favorite writers tonight. A writer living in New York who sometimes likes to transport her characters to Tel Aviv, and a writer in Tel Aviv who often brings her characters to New York City. In each case, as we'll talk about, I think those places are as imagined as recollected. Nicole Krauss and Dorit Rabinyan have each written very memorably about the journeys of men as fathers, as husbands, as lovers, but they've also written about the divergences of Homeland and Exile, and about our, I would say, incomprehension in the face of the various things that befall us. Each, I think, has voiced the fascination with juxtaposing seemingly unrelated stories to reveal some kind of commonality that seems both surprising and inevitable. And today we have the chance to hear these two writers in conversation for the first time, and maybe to discover some surprising commonalities and convergences between them. So let me just briefly introduce our guests tonight, and then I'll mostly step out of the way and let you hear from them. Nicole Krauss is the award-winning author of the international bestsellers Great House, The History of Love, and Forest Dark. Her most recent book, To Be a Man, is her first collection of short stories. As we'll see, it traverses the globe really, from Switzerland to Japan to New York, LA, Tel Aviv. Her books have been translated into 37 languages. Born in Israel to an Iranian Jewish family, Dorit Rabinyan is the acclaimed author of novels including Persian Brides, Strand of 1,000 Pearls, and most recently, All the Rivers, which spent more than a year as the #1 best-selling novel in Israel, translated into English by Jessica Cohen. And Dorit also writes screenplays for television. Dorit and Nicole, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you both.
Thank you. Nice to see you both.
Welcome home, Nicole. I refer you as a homie, as a local.
Yes, I am. As you can see from the background, I'm not in New York. I'm in Tel Aviv, so thank you.
We can recognize by the light.
The light. Okay.
The dazzling light. Benji, I beg you not to step out of the way and stay with us, and converse with us, because you have so much from the two topics within you, Exile and Homeland. You, in a way, manifest the both in your personality and in your choices of life.
Well, thank you. I wanted to start on a somewhat unorthodox note with both of you, and that is, before we get to writing, I'd like to ask you about not writing. And starting with Dorit, I'd like to ask both of you, what happens to you between books, in the in-between space we call in Hebrew ben hazmanim? I mean, maybe you could share with us a word or two about whether those in-between times are as important to your craft and your experience of yourself as when you're actually immersed in writing a book. Do you experience at that time the blank page as a kind of reproach to you? What is that experience like of being in between books, of not writing?
If I may elaborate the question, there are times within writing a book, writing a novel, since it's such a long-term craft, of, excuse me, I have to readjust my jaw speaking English. During this endurance of writing a novel, there are phases that are blank as much as in between one book to another. So for me, it's a black hole of sucking me into this voidness, and I'm lost. I'm lost. I remember you, Nicole, speaking about this circumstances of not being as exercised with your skills and having your personality sucked in this void, this sense of lost. And I felt I wanted to hug you reading those lines of how eliminate we become.
Yeah, it is a difficult passage between books, and I've always wondered about writers who manage to go from one book to another. I think there's a long practice of dividing all kinds of groups of people, including writers, into two groups. And so I'm going to be guilty of that now, but I think there are those writers who do kind of know their idea in advance, maybe even 5 books in advance, and then they're able to book after book execute an idea. And I've just never been able to write like that. There's something in me that probably resists that, but even if I wanted to, I couldn't work like that. I think because for me, the only way to be engaged with the writing is when I am discovering something, when I feel that with every page, I'm being surprised. And so I can never know where I'm going. But recently I've been thinking a lot about the idea that this long, difficult passage that sometimes can be months, and in my case, sometimes it's been years, in which I'm writing, but not writing a book. Sorry, is that a weird sound? Okay. Is actually, in some ways, a part of the process. And that, you know, when I was younger, I thought a lot about the idea that one wrote in order to have written books, to have a book in one's hand. But now I kind of think that long process, the book that comes out at the end, the process that begins before whenever starts writing, the book itself is just a kind of fossil in a sense. It's aside the point. I mean, it's what the reader experiences, and it's good that it exists in the world. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to support our bizarre addiction. But that book is just a fossil of this incredible, I almost want to call it like a high that happens when suddenly, after months and years of thinking, you find like a groove, and that groove suddenly gives you fluency. And not just fluency, it gives you suddenly almost a remarkable intelligence that doesn't belong to you, that's beyond your own. And I can only think about that in an almost mystical way, and that you find this groove where it's almost like you're feeling the wall and you find a hole and it opens into a capaciousness, and you can suddenly see all the way to the horizon. And when that happens, it's like everything in your life, everything you were and everything you are and everything you ever will be makes sudden sense. And it is really like being on a kind of drug. And then the book is finished and it goes out into the world, and your days turn a little grayer again, and the winds start to blow, and it's harder for a long while. But I feel like that time we're gathering up experience, and we're changing so that we can write something new.
Am I heard well, or should I take off the device and use a straight sound? Not this way?
I can hear you just fine.
Yeah.
Just fine this way or the other way around? This way.
This
Yeah,
way.
it's better.
Okay. That's much better. I suggest perhaps looking more positively on those ending days of having accomplished a whole session of writing, having this vitality increase, and having the colors of the world become much brighter and much more intense. And this could be, in a way, an opposite of describing what it is for days without writing, that I somehow feel detached and I feel my existence is not as much as coherent to me as when I do get to arrive at my desk and meditate and isolate and focus and have 1 more millimeters progress in my writing. So this is for me a cure for all illnesses, the possibility to concentrate, to find my inner voice, and to be a queen in my queendom. Is there a term as a queendom?
There is now.
Is that something I can own? Anyway, this is the in between times are frustrating, and the places, perhaps it's a third place to add to this relationship between Exile and Homeland, the place where literature exists and where we are citizens, active citizens in.
So that brings us actually to a sense of how place works in each of your imaginations. Let's talk for a second about that. I was wondering whether you think that Nicole's relation to Tel Aviv is comparable to Dorit's relation to New York. And let me expand on that. Maybe we can start with you, Nicole. In a sense, if it weren't for Israel, I mean, you wouldn't exist. You said that your parents have met here, they married here before they moved to the States. I think your maternal grandparents lived in Jerusalem. It's not just that you visited often when you were growing up, but that this place has taken on a meaning for you. But it's, I assume, more than just a site of meeting and of encounter. It's more than a site of matchmaking that made you possible.
Yes, I wouldn't exist. My father wouldn't exist either because his parents met in Nahalal in the 30s and they came from 2 different countries. So it's a long line of not existing unless luck aligned in this small piece of land. I think, to be a writer is always to want more than one world. So if we can just back up a little bit before we even talk about one geography or another, maybe we can say that to your writers to believe that this one life or this one being is not enough. There's a kind of like almost greediness for more being and more worlds and more lives. And so we multiply ourselves in the form of characters, inventing characters. And we have this extraordinary opportunity, which we taste for the first time as readers. I think readers share this opportunity to become other people, like significantly, profoundly to become other people when we enter into a deep relationship with a book, with characters that we love. And I think writers then, capitalize on this and make it a life's work. And so there's not just becoming other people, but there's the knowledge that there's this one world with its laws of being and laws of reality. And then there's a second, what I always think of as a parallel world, which is the world of literature. And in the world of literature, the laws of being and how things move and the possibilities in life are very different than they are here. But the two reflect obviously off of each other. And we take things that we learn in that parallel world back to this world. And so I think writers kind of have this sense of wanting to have a foot in 2 worlds, this one and that parallel world. And so already we're kind of formed in that style. So it makes a kind of sense that we would follow that we also, if possible, would like more than one geography, right? Or more than one culture, or more than one style of life, or something that we don't. So if we could say that we're each born into our local neighborhood with its texture and color and feeling, the way, let's say, Philip Roth was born into Newark, which he used and squeezed like a sponge all his life. Well, how wonderful when Newark runs out or you get tired of how things are in Newark, where you could go somewhere else where things are completely different. And that's kind of how I feel about, being an American writer and knowing this other place, Israel, as intimately as I do. I would never mistake myself for knowing it as a native does, but I know that when I come here, there's a whole realm of stories and a surreality or 3,000 years of history that are in some ways mine to write about as well. And so in my greediness, I grab both.
It's interesting. I wonder if your adjustment to Israel when you arrived has not also to do with your, not only your language, since you get to hear more Hebrew than you're used to, but also your body language, perhaps your gazes. Do you have a sense of readjusting?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think I have friends who recognize my Israeli face and my New York face. And I don't think I need to explain to anyone listening the differences between those two faces. Yeah, I mean, there's a completely different way that, as you pointed out, the way the light feels on you here, the way the rhythm of the day passes, the way people speak to each other, the expectations of interaction, the wildness of what can happen on the street versus what can happen on the street in New York. They're just completely different pools of reality. And I feel very different in both, the same way that when you speak English, you had to adjust your jaw, but you were adjusting your personality, actually. You weren't just adjusting your physicality. We are always somebody else in a different culture or a different light or language. So yeah, and I actually revel in that. I think there are people who don't like that. But for me, again, it's just another doorway into something else, something else to be, somewhere else to go.
I can quote you on this. I can use your description of your adaptive self into the streets of Tel Aviv. The very same thing happens to me when I lay my foot in New York ground. The unexpected becomes so much more realistic because of me traveling to this parallel option of myself. You were following your biographical circumstance of your family. I chose New York to be my second favorite, perhaps formative city. And I sometimes can look at you and see how we swap apartments and identities and possibilities because of this parallel option of being here and there and here. And perhaps the meeting point is the written word and storytelling. And for me, New York is more of a metaphor. And I believe the difference with you is that Tel Aviv is more concrete.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also, maybe just to add that there's a little passage in Forest Dark where one of the characters is talking about her one of her earliest memories. And actually I borrowed that wholesale from my own life. And my earliest memory is of being like a 2-year-old and watching this television show where there was like a studio audience of kids. Like, I don't know if you guys remember in the 70s, that used to happen before they had technology, real technology. There was like, you would watch the kids sitting and watching a show. And I was sure that I saw myself on the show. And yet I'd never been on the show. But the realization was uncanny. And I just remember it so vividly that it just made my hair rise in the back of my head. This girl was wearing the sneakers that I have. And in the novel, I write that when she turned, that she had a look in her eyes that I knew could only be me. And that is my earliest memory. And I think that there's something strange and significant and maybe writerly about, even at the earliest levels of the stratifications of memory, having the sense of being in two places at once. And that this is what is required of us as writers, that we can sustain that in some way, maybe not more than sustain it, that we long for it, that there's a split this is a split in our, I mean, most of us have many splits in our personalities, right? Where we have a multiplicity of personalities on some level, but that the sense of this strong divide where we can be both here and elsewhere, also there. And I think that's a through line in a lot of my writing, going back to the beginning.
Thanks so much. That's fantastic to begin with. The idea that you could recognize the other you, the Israeli you, the local you, via the screen. You perhaps know that there's a phase in the infant life that the child, we all go through it. Some of us make career out of it, but there's a phase that it's the yearning for twinship, the aspiration for twinship, that we face ourselves in the mirroring glass, and the idea of reflection strikes us, and that may cause perhaps the contemplation of a possible me wandering elsewhere, and this is perhaps a nutshell capture of literary existence, in a sense that let's start with being readers. We live in someone else's consciousness, in someone else's mind, and we travel through the path of imagination, and cooperate with this imagination by recruiting, by activating our own imagination. And this, if I may add, perhaps the hope of literature to survive all these technology devices, experiences of consuming storytelling, because of this collaboration of fantasy grounds in both sides. Watching the story consumed via the screen is so lazy. It requires nothing of our collaboration.
I must say, I would be perfectly content to let the two of you interview each other next time. It's such a pleasure to listen to.
Yeah, I was waiting for you. We also want to hear from you, Ben.
Let me just ask one further question on this theme of belonging and home. First with Nicole. I mean, I want to look at this idea of the Jewish talent for making things portable, for portability. In a sense, that's the way I read your book, Great House, and the story of the stolen desk, as a sort of meditation on this question. On the one hand, like, what is a Jew without Jerusalem? What is a Jew without a homeland? What is this special Jewish talent for portability? I sensed actually something similar stirring in the first section of Forest Dark that you mentioned, which is called Ayeka, where are you? It's a question that the narrator is asking herself. What is this talent for portability, and how does it figure in your imagination of being both here and elsewhere?
Well, I guess reams have been written about that, and that moment in which, that's sort of the Great House quotes from toward the end of the book, when Jerusalem sort of burns, and then there's the exile and the writing down, beginning to write down of what becomes the oral law and Mishnah, and basically creating something, that text that can be carried under the arm, and can unify people. And that moment seems to be, to me, I think, to so many people, the most significant moment in some ways of Jewish memory. I think Jewish or Jewish history, and that Jewish history was about to begin then. So I think, there's actually, I was reading, maybe you'll remember this better than I will, Ben, but there's a really beautiful moment in a George Steiner essay about this, where he muses that maybe it was sort of an accident that the temples of David and Solomon were a kind of effort to create an architectural space, right? I mean, an imaginary architectural space in which to house all of this that is abstract, and that maybe that was a mistake because it was a move away from that kind of portability, right? But I'm not sure what else I can add to it beyond the fact that I think it's part of what gives me at least a sort of confidence as a writer, particularly a Jewish writer, that I can move as widely geographically and temporally as I want, because we have such a long tradition of doing that. And I don't know, maybe it's, yes, I think it's a sort of confidence of that, that I'm working in a medium in which that, that there's the privilege of that.
I think maybe this is a point of difference between you and Dorit, in the sense of this idea that of Jews kind of living outside of history. In one of the short stories in this latest book, you have this character Broadman, who really has this idea that Jews live outside of history, or at least until the Messiah arrives. It seems to me that in Dorit's, your writing, you don't conceive of Jews as living outside of history, but very much inside of history, very much as working within the operations, however mundane, however degraded, of reality. Would you say that that's true?
Are you saying that I'm a result of the Israeli education system, of the privilege of owning this sovereignty, this existence of Jewish life within the Middle East? So yes, we live politics much more intensely than we live history. It takes a perspective to observe history, and it's especially when it gets so neurotic. History is not easily attached. It's the daily life. It's the hectic happenings that take place, and perhaps it's a more challenging experience for a writer, because we do need perspective to create. Writing does demands us to take those few steps back and see the whole picture. It's not as easy to describe the present as much as it to describe what happened yesterday and a year ago and perhaps thousands of years ago.
Let me briefly, or did you want to say something, Nicole, to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add something to the thought, which was that I wouldn't argue. I mean, it's an interesting reading of the Broadman story, but the Broadman is really drawing on partially on Yerushalmi's book Zakor, because that character is based in part on him and in part on others. But and that notion of, was it in a sense, was it a mistake to move from thousands of years of Jewish memory into a kind of organized sense of Jewish history, that maybe that's so I was playing with those ideas, but I mean, I don't think it's possible to live outside of history. I think that's a romantic idea, but it's just not the reality. But what I would say is that I think you're right that, like, in my heart, what matters to me, and I hope this doesn't come off sounding the wrong way, but I don't, maybe it's better to say, I don't feel it's my talent to reflect this moment in time and this moment in history. And I feel like my hope, more than anything, the thing that I want to touch in my writing, if at all possible, or the things that I love in the books that I love, is something that touches the eternal, like that opens to the eternal. That's kind of almost what I mean when I talked about like knocking on the walls and then suddenly a capaciousness opens and you can see far out. That I'm looking for those moments that they are here, they're lodged here, they're rooted here in what it is to live now, but they want to open out to what that attaches us in that line all the way back to something that is in some ways eternal.
There's a beautiful phrase that you use in one of the stories in this book, where you use the phrase transience and transcendence. And I feel like that's one of the great themes that ties together these short stories, is that tension between transience and transcendence. I just want to step in for a second and say, just relate a couple of anecdotes about this question of the being here and being elsewhere, specifically being in Israel and being in New York. You mentioned Nicole Philip Roth. I once, for my first book, I interviewed Roth, and he asked me, well, like, how are my books, received in Hebrew and among the Israeli readership? And he expressed great dissatisfaction, actually. And he said, I never had the sense that my books really resonate there in the same way that they do here. And it's not the fault of the translators. I have the best translators, most capable translators in the world. There must be something else. And he suggested something that has stuck with me ever since. He said, well, so much of what happens in my books is that the characters are sort of clawing their way from the Jewish minority into the cultural mainstream. And that's not a struggle that many Israeli readers can really identify with. The second small anecdote, since we're being hosted by the Agnon Festival, relates to the occasion in which Saul Bellow came to Jerusalem in the late 60s. And almost as soon as he set his bags down in Mishkenot, he paid a pilgrimage to Agnon. And Agnon, the very first question Agnon asked him was, he said, Saul, are your books translated into Hebrew yet? And Bellow said, I'm not sure. I mean, it's not, why is it so important? And Agnon said, only if they're translated into Hebrew do they stand a chance of immortality.
The reason I have to believe that story is apocryphal is that there's no way a writer doesn't know which languages his books are translated.
It's true. That's true. That's fixation. It sounds, and both those bright authors are quoted with such lame sayings of wisdom. I mean, it's not a monopoly taken by American Jews to have this sense of outsider observation of the vastness of where they accumulate in, and the eternity that Agnon is depending one's writing upon is having his texts translated into Hebrew. Is also sounds, excuse me, Agnon, it sounds a little bit nonsense nowadays. Though I must say that a choosing the term of going to Agnon's house as one is visiting a holy place is for me so much to do. Every time I get to visit, I feel like it's one of Israel's literature saints. We don't have saints in Judaism, but for me it's a ground of reconnecting with some giant greatness that I need my hands to dip in this atmosphere of work that is left within the walls of the house of Agnon.
I have a question for both of you that maybe one of you can answer. If not, someone can answer later. I was told by a friend of mine that at the Agnon house, where I've been, but I failed to notice this detail, that there's a cup of tea that's that is left there, sort of half drunk, and it's somebody's job every month to refill the half cup of tea, like Elijah's cup.
That sounds equally apocryphal to me, but I love it. But sometimes apocrypha is the best part of biblical literature.
Can you translate what the term you used, Benji? Apocrypha? Apocrypha, what does it mean?
Apocrypha is, that part of the extra biblical literature that didn't quite make it into the canon. you know.
Okay.
It's
And you referred to the cup of tea.
Yeah, and sometimes the Apocrypha has the best stories.
The details.
We more or less work in Apocrypha. That's our gig.
Wow, that's a great line. That's a very, very well put.
I also have to note that the one place I think in your book, the book of short stories, To Be a Man, Nicole, where Agnon comes up, is an ambivalent reference in the sense that you have Brodman bring his daughter, who's hospitalized in a psychiatric ward, a book of stories by Agnon, and she's utterly incapable at that stage of absorbing anything like that. It's a gesture that shows sort of how off the mark Brodman is, no?
Yeah. I'd forgotten about that book being there. And Agnon also shows up in Forest Dark too. So now that I'm thinking about it, I guess there's a little tradition there. I'll have to slip him into the next book too.
I want to
just may I add that being such a huge fan of American literature and writers, I always feel like an ignorant that I cannot enjoy this treasury in the original language, but I have my hands above Nicole in the sense of reading Agnon in Hebrew and enjoying this endless whale of Hebrew, of this exquisite Hebrew that now needs to be translated into Israeli nowadays kind of Hebrew for the current generations to decipher, since it's so elaborated and so layered with sources.
A follow-up for both of you, starting with you, Dorit. You both just now mentioned being here and being elsewhere, being in these two worlds, the imagined, the narrative world, and the real world. It's very interesting to me to ask about when one of those worlds, when the real world invades, or there's an incursion from the real world into the fictional. And I remember, Dorit, you told me once that you described to me that morning in December 2015, when you glanced at the front page of the Israeli newspapers, and you saw two photographs staring back at you from the front page, yours and those of then Minister of Education, Naftali Bennett, under the headline, Education Minister rejects novel about Arab-Jewish love affair. And if I remember correctly, you said that, that Naftali Bennett was condemning your book, All the Rivers, at the very same time that he flatly denied reading it. And I wanted to ask you, like, with the passage of time, and now, of course, that Bennett is prime minister, how do you look back on that bewildering storm that started in that December day?
It has been exactly 5.5 years. Oh, 6.5 years. It's starting to fade out, I believe. In people's consciousness as much as mine, perhaps I'm post-traumatic, having my life changed, not thanks or credited to my will, but also mainly having people in power to somehow open a route to elsewhere. And this could be related to us discussing parallel selves. I was, somebody is saying something sweet on the chat. Thank you, Amnon. This pivot, I do know who taught me which word. You taught me the word pivot. This pivot of me within my skin, and the me looking back at me from the headlines of those 4 front pages of Israel's main newspapers. And this was perhaps the uncanny mentioned by you, Nicole. It was the most uncanny experience I ever went through. This sense of the daily life or the daily me that contained itself. And then there was this hand that had slapped the globe in which was my life. I was somehow like a swirl has started, and this gap was enlarged from 1 minute to another, and I don't think time can close it down back to where it used to. So Diane, for the reminder that it had increased my sales of the book enormously, but I had to pay back with 3 months of non-sleep. So I'm not sure it's such a good trade. And I don't think Israeli democracy had gained so much credit for having a first book to be banned from the high school curriculum. So it's not a huge observation of the character of our new prime minister, but I must say, since I have to be honest, that it's such a great relief in the other hand around of unboxing ourselves from this magician charisma influence. So we shouldn't go into the politics, but yet, since you mentioned it, it's a new era that I'm trying to adjust to.
And Nicole, have you ever felt the incursion of the real, pleasant or unpleasant, into your fictional creations?
Yeah, in a good way though. Like a lot of stories come flooding to mind, but one of my favorite ones that I can tell is there's a story in To Be a Man that was, it's called Seeing Arshadi. And to make a not so long story very, very short, it's about a woman who becomes obsessed with a film by the Iranian director Kiarostami called Taste of Cherry, which stars the actor Humayun Arshadi. So this actor is front and center in the story. The thing she becomes obsessed with is that he wasn't acting, that this character in this film, who the whole film is about him having dug his grave and just simply looking for somebody who will put earth on him in the morning, which of course is against the Quran. It's very difficult to find anyone to do this. She's convinced that that actor wasn't acting, that he had to have felt that despair himself, and there's a desire to somehow save him. Anyway, the story was published in the New Yorker, and 2 days after it came out, the son of Abbas Kiarostami, the director, who had just recently died, wrote to me and said, oh, you know, everyone is texting me about this story, and he told me what his dad would have thought of it, and it was a nice exchange. And then I asked him, do you have any idea if Arshadi read the story, this actor who still lives in Tehran? And he said, you know what, I can find out, I'll write to his sister. And then like the next day I got this letter and from Kiarostami's son, and it basically said, you know, it turns out that he, the actor, was going through a tough time, as many of us do in life. And suddenly his phone is like full of texts and emails, and everybody's writing him from all over the world about his appearance in the story. And he feels a lot better, like it really cheered him up. And then he sent me this screenshot of Arshadi's Facebook page, and he had just posted the story like without comment. And I just thought there's this remarkable way in which like art imitates life, imitates art, imitates life in this cycle that we see sometimes, but this was somehow writ large for me. And it was a very touching moment.
Fantastic story.
It reminds me of a phrase actually in the new book, Nicole, where you speak about, I think it's Brodman again, where you say that he pushed the idea of the child through the tight passage of incredulity.
Ooh, what is incredulity, Benji, please?
Incredulity is sort of the suspension of disbelief, right?
Oh, okay, incredible.
Yes. And I thought, well, this is sort of an apt description of what you just talked about. I mean, it almost strains incredulity. It strains credulity to think that this had happened. But it also struck me as a way of describing writing itself, you know, that you're pushing an idea through the tight passage of incredulity, with the obvious birth connotations involved.
Yeah, I think that I've been doing it now for long enough, I guess, 19 years that I've been publishing books to have enjoyed the privilege of watching what happens when the things one writes go out into the world and do things. And I think you're right. There's a echo of that incredible thing. On the one hand, it happens when you're writing it. You are pushing the isn't into the is, what is non-existent into some form of existence in language. And then that language goes on this journey into readers' lives, and things happen and come back to you there. And there was a moment not long ago when I realized, I sort of looked out from a precipice onto my life and realized that almost everybody that I know and I'm really close to, with the exception of, my immediate family, came to me because I sent books out or stories out into the world, that somehow or other, that's how I met all of these people. I mean, even the existence of my own children. So I think that there's something miraculous about that. And that's why I said before, I mean, maybe I'm not so shy to say that I think there's something almost mystical about it, not just mystical about the process of how the wall opens and things come to us out of seemingly nowhere. And we can't explain why and how we wrote the books that we wrote, or how we know or knew the things that we know, but also something, beyond coincidence that happens when the books go out without us and do things. And bring us back people and experience and all kinds of other things.
And I believe that I can add that every book has its own destiny. It's very interesting to watch over a book and to see the roots that it goes through its own life once it's out there, and how it relates to people in different ways. Somehow, like humans do get to have their own fortune.
Dorit, I hope you won't mind my quoting it in public, but you once told me that when you were experiencing the writing, the immersion in the writing of what became your child, All the Rivers, that you felt that you weren't writing a love story as much as you were writing the story of an extended resistance to love. And I've always remembered that phrase. And I wonder if you could share with us what that experience is like. What is the difference between writing a love story and writing the story of resistance to love?
It's a great joy writing a love story, and I had to write it in order to describe the powers that rise against it. And I believe that what I was trying to paint was the portrait of an Israeli the forces of education enabled her to be as free and as willing to follow her own heart's desires. And that made it more interesting than only transcripting the mind's and the heart's voyage towards the other, towards knowing the other from within, recollecting the idea of being someone else. Love romantic love allows us to become the other that we love. The intimate other becomes me, and I become him or she, and this symbiotic closeness may be the core of all the rivers, of the sphere of getting lost, of getting devoured. Here I use my jaw, devoured by this need to know the one you love from within. So this is the reason she Liat Binyamini, my character, she goes through the difficulty of needing to have the contour of our own identity, not to be erased or perhaps vague. In order to love, you have to let go. You have to be subsumed, to be mixed. And this is in a way that as Jews, we internalize from day one that mixing is not recommended, to say the least. All those rituals that we go through as practicing Jews of dividing one from another ought to be mentioned from one generation to another in order to keep ourselves within our own community, to not get involved and to keep ourselves isolated, to be remembered that we are different. And that became very ironic that this storyline of having the Israeli heroine struggle to not get mixed, this book was blamed of encouraging assimilation, according to the Israeli Ministry of Education. But this came after the book was published. 18 months, this book was a work of art, a work of literature, and then it became some sort of a political symbol. But this struggle was the theme I was using. But in order to struggle, I had to plant the trees and grow this garden of love. And that was the best part of it. The outline of herself and himself, and having them be so intimate and close in New York and not get lost in one another.
It's a beautiful way of putting it.
Thank you.
Nicole, I was wondering whether love and the biochemistry of love has come up in your conversations with neuroscientists. You've been just now the first writer in residence at the Zuckerman Mind and Brain Behavior Institute, I think it's called, at Columbia University. Have you had such conversations about the scientific basis or biochemical basis of love as opposed to the
I don't
fictional?
Well, I'll just back up and say that when I arrived there, it was my hope and impression that people would be thinking about and studying things just like that, the same kinds of things that interest us in the world of literature. And I remember sitting down and saying to them, like, wait, but you mean nobody here is like studying consciousness, or isn't anybody thinking about the like presence or absence, existence or non-existence of free will? And I was almost laughed out of the room because we know so little. What I understood again and again and again, we know so little about how the brain works, if those questions like what is love and how does it work are just simply too large, or they would describe them in physiological ways that wouldn't satisfy you. So there's, for example, there's somebody at the Institute who's studying monogamy in mice. That's maybe the closest that you will get to that larger questions like that. But I will say that that time, I just finished my time. I was there for actually a year and a half, and it was really truly remarkable, because even if I didn't learn the things that I might have hoped or expected to learn, simply because they can't be known yet, I learned an enormous amount. You know, the neuroscience, toward the end of my time, I kind of made up a series of unanswerable questions that I asked about 12 of the neuroscientists, including sort of, you know, Nobel Prize winners who probably would never otherwise have talked to me, to kind of play with me and try to answer some of these unanswerable questions. Just like, what do you think if you had to say something? And I imagine this project as a kind of woman who would be standing before a jury of neuroscientists asking them, why am I the way that I am? So I won't describe what the questions are, but it was really remarkable to ask that same set of questions to so many different neuroscientists and see how varied their answers were. Their playful answers, again, because they were highly creative. Yeah.
And what did they most want to ask you about? What were they most curious, these neuroscientists, about your craft?
No, I think that people are not just neuroscientists, but people, you know, are always curious about how, about creativity. Of course, like, you know, one thing that neuroscientists do think a lot about, for example, obviously, is memory and narrative, how we shape narrative, what role memory has to play. So there was a lot of conversation about that, I think. But I think that neuroscientists are in some ways no different than any other kinds of readers, in that there's this kind of like bafflement of how does this come into being? And as much as Dorit or I or you, Ben, or any other writer could try to describe that, short of being able to put electrodes into our brains, which we still can't do, at least not ethically, we won't know, we don't know. And even then we couldn't really know, I think. And so there's a lot, again, my answers were as creative and sort of hypothetical about their questions as vice versa. But I feel for both sides, it was a really, really rich exchange. Before Corona, we had started a book club where we were reading. I talked about my work, but we were talking about other writers' works, and but then Corona intervened. But no, it was a wonderful time, and I don't yet know how all of that learning will play out in my next book, but I'm sure that it will.
Benji, may I be excused for asking a very earthy question?
Earthy is good.
Okay, scientists versus authors. Which is the conclusion after a year and a half in Columbia laboratories?
We need them both. What do you mean? Which? Luckily, the world has room for both of us. We can't do without either. I mean, you know, I think it's always when you look at somebody else's work, you both see, even if it's another artist, right? You must have this story where you envy, for example, musicians, that they get up in front of thousands of people and perform, and what it must feel like to connect in that strange zone that music brings us to. Or I don't know, I always envy painters for big and large things, like little things like that they can listen to music while they
if we can mention Agnon again, in his speech in Sweden, given the Nobel Prize for Literature, he said that since God hasn't given him the talent to sing, he was lucky enough to be given the words to praise the singing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, right, so we always envy that voice, metaphorical or not, that we don't have. But for example, I always envy choreographers, that they can work with a company instead of working alone, for example. But there are things about being a scientist that I certainly envy. But I have to say that at the end of the day, I wouldn't trade my job for anything, because we have really, I think, maximal freedom. I mean, I think we pay the price for it in that maybe we're ending where we began with the difficulty of being alone with one's nothingness between books, but we don't have to write grants, you know, like scientists do in order just to do an experiment, for example. We can experiment with some words by ourselves on a page and nobody need know about it or sanction it. And we don't have to be right. We can just ask the questions without coming away with a written answer. So I think there are a lot of ways in which I felt comforted by my choice of profession, but that doesn't mean that we don't that we don't suffer it too.
I totally agree that we don't have to be right. That popping up with the question is our job to be.
And not only that, I think it's not even about not being right. I think that what interests me and most writers is what happens when people are wrong. You know, why do we make the mistakes that we do? Why do we hit the walls or the dead ends that we do in life? I mean, Ben, you posed the question, how did you put it about a love story or resistance to a love story? But without resistance, there's no conflict and therefore there's no story, right? So we need the problems, the mistakes, the wrong-headedness in order, I think, to make literature.
Yeah, we need the weaknesses to make a great character. And the more pettiness involved in it, the greater the human spirit is set free to.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, our hour has drawn to a close. I want to thank you, Dorit, so much for joining us, and you, Nicole. I hope we can see each other in person in Tel Aviv, in the real Tel Aviv, rather than in
Thank you so much for you both.
And I want to just end with a note of humility, which I think belongs really to the entire Agnon Festival, perhaps. And that note comes from the novel Forest Dark, one of my favorite passages, where this surly professor says to the Nicole Krauss character, he says, he wants to sort of deflate her a little bit. And he says, you think your writing belongs to you? And she responds, who else? And without missing a beat, he responds, to the Jews. So that's my wish, that our writing, in a sense, belongs to the Jews. That's Agnon's, the apocryphal Agnon's reply to Bello, that in a sense, even for the best of us, our writing maybe belongs to the Jews and not particularly to our own sensibilities. So
this is you said you want to end up with humility, with modesty.
Yes. No,
this is your note about modesty. That we write for the Jews.
Or as Kafka would have said, he said, you know, what do I have in common with myself? I have hardly anything in common with the Jews.
No, he said it the other way around. What do I have in common with the Jews? I have.
And with the Jews, I have hardly anything in common with myself. Thank you. Yes.
The most universal storyteller of the world.
Yeah. Thank
Good
you.
night to you both. Thank you to Asaf at Bet Agnon.
Thank you for this wonderful.
It's been a great pleasure.
Conversation. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Dorit and Nicole. You are invited to meet here in the Agnon House in Jerusalem. We will be happy and thrilled to have you here. And you mentioned the cup of tea that we fill every week, by the way. And I have to say that Leah Goldberg, the poet, have a memory of visiting the Tolstoy house in Russia. And the only thing she remembers is his cup of water, glass of water that he has beside his bed. This is her only memory, and it's a symbol for Tolstoy's modesty, the empty cup of with water. So this is why we keep the cup of tea of Agnon. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We were thrilled to have you here. Thank you. תודה רבה לניקול ולדורית ולבנג'מין על השיחה הנפלאה הזאת. אנחנו ניפגש כאן ב8:30, אתם יכולים להישאר באותו קישור לשיח סופרים עם חיים באר, צרויה שלו ובילה בן אליהו. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Me too.